Hi, this is Wayne Norman. I'm your instructor for physiological psychology, and I have a couple of slide presentations that I hope will help you with the papers that you'll be writing. The first two, spiritual explanation paper and physiological explanation paper, are the first two parts of what the final assignment will be. And the final assignment, as you've probably read, is not a paper, but is a slide presentation which you put together. So in this slide, or in this presentation, what I want to do is go through what is involved in the spiritual explanation paper, and also to give you some advice about how I think you can write a better paper. So in terms of getting started, and I will just read through the slides and then make some comments. For this assignment, you will be identifying spiritual or supernatural explanations of a psychological process. And later you're going to compare that to some recent physiological findings about that same process. You will also, in this paper, explore the cultural influences and the ethical implications of this perspective. And I'm using the word perspective instead of explanation because I think it will help you. If you come up with a perspective on how people view, let's just say, depression from a spiritual point of view, that doesn't necessarily mean that that has fully explained depression, but it is a perspective on depression. So I encourage you to use that word in your own mind, perspective, rather than explanation, because I think it takes some of the pressure off to try to feel like you have fully explained something from a spiritual or supernatural point of view, or even from a physiological point of view. So in step one then, what you need to do is identify some psychological process that has had, in the past or presently, a spiritual or a supernatural perspective. And I think we all know what we mean by spiritual, relating to some faith tradition or religious tradition. Supernatural just literally means something outside of nature. So, for example, you may have an explanation that involves strange radio waves emitting from the moon that causes people to be depressed. Well, that's not a spiritual explanation, but there's really no natural cause that, unless you can find one, for those strange radio waves. So what do we mean by a psychological process? Well, some examples would be depression or happiness, pro-social behavior, helping others, dependency. The list is pretty long, and it's up to you to come up with something that is of interest to you and something where you think you will be able to find a spiritual or supernatural perspective, and you will be able to find some physiological research that also bears on that process. I encourage you to think of not only negative sorts of processes like depression or dependency, but also some positive processes like happiness. But the choice is yours, and you should feel free to email me, to bounce some ideas off of me to see if the process that you've come up with might be a good one to work with. In step two, you're going to summarize that spiritual or supernatural perspective. And you want to make sure that as you summarize it, you base that summary not just on your opinion. I mean, your opinion is valid, but your opinion needs to be backed up by views that exist in the literature. And as you'll see later, that literature might be religious literature, it might be historical literature, it might be scientific literature, it might be literature. But the point is that you want to give some evidence for why people have looked at this process from a spiritual or supernatural perspective. So what you want to do in this is to focus on what causes the psychological process. Not spiritual elements of the psychological process. But how does that spiritual perspective help, we could say explain, but maybe it's better to say, how might it be causing the psychological process to happen? So for example, a spiritual or supernatural perspective could be that some people believe schizophrenia is caused by demon possession. Now, to talk about spiritual hallucinations would be a psychological, but not a spiritual or supernatural explanation for schizophrenia. So you can certainly talk about demon possession as a spiritual explanation or perspective on schizophrenia. But if you talk about spiritual hallucinations, in other words, hallucinations that people have that have a spiritual nature to them, that's a psychological process. That's not a spiritual explanation for schizophrenia. In step 3, you want to address how different cultures may approach and provide different perspectives on this process from a spiritual or supernatural point of view. And I really encourage you to look for information from very different cultures, not just the ones you're familiar with. So you may be familiar with several cultures that you currently live in or go in and out of. And that's legitimate. You can talk about that, and you might find some very interesting information there. But think about some very different cultures. And if you do that, you'll find that you have less of a problem finding information for this step 3. And then in step 4, you want to explore what the ethical implications are of this perspective. These should not be sort of general ethical considerations, but rather they should emphasize or focus on how the particular perspective, the particular spiritual or supernatural perspective of the problem would affect the ethics of particularly interventions. So, for instance, think about what are the ethical implications of considering that schizophrenia is caused by demon possession. How might that influence, in terms of ethics, an intervention for someone who is suffering from schizophrenia? What would you have to consider ethically? And then just a couple things to keep in mind. The references you use to document your statements may be theological or academic or historical. And really, I want to emphasize that there's pretty high importance in terms of documentation in academic writing. Having an opinion is fine. Being able to show that that opinion comes from an established body of literature is really better. So do look for references that will back up the claims you're trying to make. And then you should know that this paper is only about 2 to 3 pages long. That's excluding the title page and the reference pages. And please do use APA format. The Moodle site, the course page, has links to help you with APA format if you're not familiar with that, or if you're not sure about how to cite a particular reference. But 2 to 3 pages, that's what we're looking for. If it's under 2 pages, there will be points taken off. And then finally, please note that this paper provides one of the foundation stones for your signature assignment. That signature assignment is when you put this paper and the next paper together into a slide presentation for your peers and for me. So please review the signature assignment instructions. That's not due till much later in the term, but it would be good to look at that now to get an idea of how you're going to be able to use what you do in the spiritual explanations paper for the eventual signature assignments paper. So that's as much as I want to say for now. If you have questions about the spiritual explanation paper, do drop me a note, and it's better to ask and be sure than not to ask and take a guess. Okay, I will talk to you later. Bye.